so much of what we've been told about a big story in recent days has been wrong. It involves U.S. politics, claims of censorship, and Stephen Colbert. Those elements have been in the news, but this story also involves Arnold Schwarzenegger, Bernie Sanders, and a Biden official running to lead the most populous U.S. state. The media has pretty much ignored all of that because it doesn't fit the simple narrative they would rather give you. In preparing this episode for you, I came across some wild claims from news giants, one in particular that's just so off the rails. This story also involves right-wing radio, a couple of different laws that are easily confused with each other, and the media's pastime of taking a hammer to stories to try to reshape them. It also gets at the core of what the news is supposed to provide for our society. I'll explain coming up. Plus, why the State of the Union address might be the most frustrating night of the entire year in the battle for truth, and what we can do about it. Also today, new awesome feedback from listeners. And I finally get to do an I Stand Corrected, thanks to a shrewd listener who caught something. I'm so psyched for this. And two conversations I had that I wanted to tell you about. They are a beautiful sign of how our democracy can work. Passionate people can find common ground. Let's dig into all of this today on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for being here on this 96th episode of They Stand Corrected. When I launched this in 2024, I had no idea if I'd be able to make it last. In the attention economy, it is such an uphill battle to create anything new. Hi, I'm Josh Lives, and this is my podcast, They Stand Corrected, which fact-checks the news. I spent 20 years in mainstream media, 10 on NPR, 10 on CNN. I did a heck of a lot of on-air fact-checking at CNN, but I always saw a gaping hole in our news ecosystem. No one is fact-checking the news. Until now. Along with this show comes a newsletter. I don't expect you to take my word for anything. I share lots of links and other forms of proof and social media content and more. You can get that for free at the link in the show notes. It's on Substack. It is technically a Substack bestseller. It's just called They Stand Corrected. People who choose to take the extra simple step of becoming paid subscribers get additional content and lots of perks. And at the top of the show, I like to read some of the latest notes from paid subscribers. I'm running behind here. Let me see if I can get to two of them. Mary Cox writes, I like the reporting without a political agenda that I found on your podcast. Every episode has news and context that I don't find anywhere else. Thank you, Mary. Sharon Linford says, I supported your work because I've known for years that my left-leaning bias keeps my information consumption in a bubble, and I don't like it. She also writes that she doesn't have time to fact-check all the news she reads. Of course not. You shouldn't have to. Unfortunately, news agencies have turned into open mic platforms for all sorts of people and their own employees to get away with saying whatever they want. Another thing I bite is people to tell me if I get something wrong, and I want to thank Stephen, who alerted me as soon as a previous episode came out. I don't even think I realized I had said this, but he contacted me and said, I think you referred to John Fetterman as being Jewish himself. And I did. So fix that right away, which is why you probably did not hear it unless you managed to listen immediately when the episode came out. I explained that he is probably the most outspoken Democrat in Congress against left-wing anti-Semitism. There are others speaking out against right-wing anti-Semitism. Anyway, I love that. So thank you. As I come up on the 100th episode, I have been told I should take some time and give you all little peeks behind the scenes of just how this works for me. So I want to tell you quickly about these two different conversations I had recently that are so helpful and I think instructive. I did a couple of episodes that touched on this when protesters barged into a church in Minneapolis. Protesters who are understandably very upset about what ICE has been doing in Minneapolis, nevertheless seem to have violated a federal law called the FACE Act. And someone who went along with them, who calls himself a journalist, Don Lemon, then started broadcasting, including minors, inside this private place. And I talked about how incredibly dangerous that is. If they can get away with this, then white supremacists could barge into a black church and start screaming at parishioners there, and a streamer could follow them and broadcast from inside there and broadcast children. Or a far-left pro-Islamist terror horde could barge into a synagogue with a left-wing streamer and do the same thing. Anyway, I heard from a couple of women who are brilliant, who I've known for years, on different sides of the political spectrum. One heard part of what I said at first and was concerned and said, wait a second, but what about all this mad stuff Trump is doing? And I said, absolutely. Look, he pardoned the January 6th insurrectionists, and yet he's going after these folks in Minneapolis. That's part of the story and should absolutely be told. And I heard from a brilliant woman on the right who questioned why I was talking about Trump's moral authority to go after these protesters when she pointed out that every president uses the pardon power. I said, that's true. But the fact that he pardoned these other folks is also part of the story. Anyway, these conversations were great. They helped me realize some things I need to emphasize on the show to make sure that they are coming across clearly. And these conversations were super supportive and respectful from people who are supporting the show. It's all awesome. So keep that feedback coming. In order to have conversations in our society, we need to start with the facts. Always. We need trustworthy sources of truth. And big media continuously fails to be that, fails to pull through on that role. That brings me to this story that's been all over the news.
Our first guest tonight was banned on television last night.
That is Lawrence O'Donnell on MS Now, formerly MSNBC, introducing James Talarico, who is running in a Democratic Senate primary in Texas.
Stephen Colbert's most popular guest of the year so far is not a movie star. He's someone most Americans have never heard of until CBS decided that their viewers should not hear from him last night on Stephen Colbert's program.
This blow-up became the biggest story. Colbert's show put their interview on YouTube, where it racked up tons of views. So much of the coverage of this got basics wrong and left out important basic facts. You wouldn't know what's happening or what it means for all of us. Colbert was going to interview this guy and then announced on his show that, according to him, CBS lawyers wouldn't let him put the guy on TV.
You might have heard of this thing called the equal time rule, okay? It's an old FCC rule that applies only to radio and broadcast television, not cable or streaming, that says if a show has a candidate on during an election, they have to have all that candidate's opponents on as well.
When it comes to use of the public airwaves, there still is that old law, which any administration can try to enforce. It establishes that if you have a legally qualified candidate in a race on TV or radio over the air, then another candidate in that race can get in touch to request equal time and has to be given it. And that person only has a week to do so. So competitors can say, hey, no fair. These are public airwaves. I should get the same opportunity to reach people. That law is ancient, originally from the 1930s, in a totally different media landscape. And there are strong arguments that it shouldn't exist anymore. What should happen with that law, that's subjective, but it is still there. There are exceptions in the law, including for things like bona fide news interviews. And there is a history of how talk shows came to be seen as qualifying for that exemption. Recently, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, said that it basically doesn't see late-night comedy shows as fitting into that exemption. Now, for truth, we need facts plus context. So, crucial part of the context here, that when the Trump administration does anything with the FCC, it sets off alarm bells. Trump is wildly obsessed with entertainment shows and what they say about him, and incredibly vindictive, especially against the late-night comedy hosts who go after him. I've covered this about Colbert and Jimmy Kimmel. I've done previous episodes about those. If you haven't heard them, I encourage you to go back and listen. Big corporations that own big media organizations have also capitulated to Trump in the past, paying him millions of dollars to settle cases he brought over news interviews. These networks have business interests that make them want to settle these things. And I have said this before, I'll say it again. It's clear to me that a president should not be allowed to launch personal lawsuits over news reports while he is the president and his administration and he himself make decisions that affect their businesses. That is ripe for corruption. If he wants to launch private lawsuits, he can do that after he's no longer president. Anyway, CBS was one of the places That settled with him. So people have spidey senses up looking for corruption when this administration does anything with the FCC. But the news media took this situation, this planned interview with a Democrat, and they fed you a simplistic, nonsensical story that this is just about Trump attacking anyone who would speak with a Democrat. And they railed against CBS. Here is what Talarico himself said in that interview with Lawrence O'Donnell on MS Now.
It should be troubling to all of us, regardless of our political affiliations or our political beliefs, that the most powerful people in the country, the most powerful politicians, and the most powerful corporate executives are working together to sell out the First Amendment, to sell out our freedom of speech in order to protect their own power and their own wealth.
But the reality here is more complicated and crucial to understand because it can have long-term consequences for our democracy and for all of us. Right now, as I record this, and when that Colbert interview happened, James Talarico does not have a Republican opponent in his election. He is running in a primary against fellow Democrats. CBS says it did not ban an interview from airing the traditional way and that it just told Colbert's team they might have to allow his Democratic opponents equal time. His main opponent is Jasmine Crockett. There's also a third candidate who is polling at very small numbers, Ahmad Hassan. CBS says it was Colbert's team that decided not to run the interview. So, according to what CBS is saying, Colbert and his team had the option of having even more Democrats on and chose not to. Now, some people are trying a broader argument. They're saying, well, by putting pressure on these shows at all, the Trump administration is making it less likely that they'll interview Democratic candidates because they don't want to have to spend time interviewing ones they're not interested in, that kind of thing. The problem with that is that Colbert has had a bunch of Democrats on his show in just the last several weeks alone. And the lawyers did not apparently raise any objection because they're not currently candidates. If you are a senator, for example, and you haven't had to announce that you're running for re-election yet and become an official candidate, then this stuff doesn't apply to you. Recently, Colbert had on Senator Elizabeth Warren. She's a Democrat. He also had on Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, who is widely seen as a likely future presidential candidate. Also, Virginia's governor-elect Abigail Spanberger. And there were apparently no problems there. This whole situation worked out in favor of Talarico, big time. He got a kind of publicity any candidate would dream of. The biggest reason is that the news took the bait. Here's CNN.
This is all we're talking about, right? And Talarico's campaign actually said it raised $2.5 million in the 24 hours after the Late Show visit, which sets a single day record as he is, he's in a primary race trying to go for that seat that a Republican holds in Texas. It seems like this has really been great for him.
What fueled him here was the idea that he was banned. He posted the interview online saying, here's the interview the Trump administration doesn't want you to see. Even though, as far as we know, the Trump administration didn't weigh in specifically on this. So you can start to see how this story is messier than the two-dimensional coverage. But it runs deeper than that. This is not the first battle over a candidate getting airtime on a late-night talk show. It happened before with The Tonight Show. A Republican candidate was given airtime, and a Democratic candidate came along and said he should be given equal time. He had support from fellow Democrats. One of them went on to hold one of the highest positions in the Biden administration and is now a candidate in a very big deal race. Maybe even a potential stepping stone to the U.S. presidency. Meanwhile, there is another law that's often confused with the equal time rule. Some want it brought back. One of the people who has pushed for it to return is probably the single most popular senator on the left. Do you drink coffee? I don't, but I do drink energy drinks. I know they're probably not great for me, but I started after a doctor I used to work with. We were both on air at CNN. I used to see him guzzling them. So I was like, it can't be that bad. Anyway, here's why I bring this up. I have been looking for the easiest possible way for listeners of this show to help support it without having to sign up for anything. So there is now a button you can click in the show notes or the newsletter called Buy Me a Coffee, except I changed it to energy drink. You could toss in $1 or, for a nice significant figure, $1.80 or $18, whatever you wish. Here's what I can promise you. Knowing that you are helping fuel this effort for truth-telling will give you more energy than a fancy, overpriced, double shot, whatever, from a coffee place. And supporting this show is way, way cheaper. You don't even have to give an email to support in this way. It's just a click. It's buymeacoffee.com/JoshLebs. Give yourself that percolating sense of joy and help me keep pouring you bottomless cups of truth. And while you're there, if you want to, you can toss in a request for this show as well. I'm here to serve. Is that enough coffee puns for this break? Coffee break! Let's see, Googling coffee puns. Oh, these are awful. I love you a latte. You mocha me crazy. Oh, I can't espresso how appreciative I am. Okay, that one's all right. Don't worry, be frappy. That doesn't even rhyme unless you pronounce it wrong. Buymeacoffee.com/JoshLebs. Thanks. When big mainstream media decide what the story is, they pretty much tell you the exact same things. They feed off of each other, repackaging the same narratives. That's been happening with this battle over a Senate candidate on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. But the presentation you've been given hides reality from you. The reality is that some prominent Democrats have previously pushed for the equal time rule. There's something that happened 20 years ago you should know about. CNN mentioned it in a broadcast the other day.
The FCC has exempted talk shows, like late night shows, for the last 20 years after Jay Leno interviewed Arnold Schwarzenegger on The Tonight Show when he was running for governor in California. But last month, FCC Chairman Brendan Carr said that's no longer the case, particularly for programs that he felt were, quote, motivated by partisan purposes. Colbert had a message for Carr.
FCCU. Donald Trump's administration wants to silence anyone who says anything bad about Trump on TV because all Trump does is watch TV.
Keep in mind what I pointed out earlier. In this case, according to CBS, Colbert would need to offer equal time to other Democrats. There would be more people slamming Trump on the show. We don't know all the details of what really transpired behind the scenes, but you heard the reference in there to Arnold Schwarzenegger and The Tonight Show. In 2006, then governor of California, Schwarzenegger, was interviewed on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno. And at that time, he was up for re-election. He had first come into office in a special election. So this re-election was his first traditional election. Anyway, after he was on The Tonight Show, his Democratic opponent complained. This man was Phil Angelides. He said he should get equal time under the equal time rule. And he wasn't alone. He had people in his camp fighting for him. One of those people was in Congress at the time, and his name is Xavier Becerra. He went on to serve as Secretary of Health and Human Services under Biden, helping lead us out of the COVID era. He is now running for governor of California. Back when this Leno thing happened, he wrote a letter complaining that the equal time rule should apply. That was ultimately rejected. Given that he is a prominent Democrat who has fought for equal time on late night comedy, you would think the media would be rushing to interview him about this right now. But they aren't. They haven't even told you about him or the fact that this happened because it complicates the narrative. Meanwhile, there was another rule, the fairness doctrine. That one was about having different sides represented of a controversial issue. There are some political figures who want the government to bring back that. One of them, Bernie Sanders, senator from Vermont, former Democratic presidential candidate, although he's not a Democrat. He is a progressive senator, an independent who caucuses with Democrats. Anyway, he wrote in his book that he wants the FCC to bring back the fairness doctrine. The latest version of that book was published in 2015 and updated in 2019, and that section is still there. Opponents of the fairness doctrine say good riddance, that it was government interference in free speech, that it was a First Amendment violation. But here you've got a very prominent left-wing lawmaker who wants the return of that. The media doesn't talk about this. The media is also pretty much ignoring some important points that Jasmine Crockett herself has made about this Colbert situation. Here she is on MS Now.
We actually received a phone call. They explained that they actually told CBS that they could go ahead and move forward with the interview of James Talarico. They just needed to offer me equal time. I did not get a request from the Colbert show to go on. No, I've been on Colbert multiple times. If we would have gotten an offer, that would have been great.
She also mentioned something involving the ABC show, The View.
You talked about The View. Supposedly this FCC complaint came about because I had more time than Mr. Talarico when I went on there after I declared my candidacy.
Both she and Talarico were on that show at different times. It's unclear what exactly the Trump administration is trying to look into with that. And it is very safe to assume that the Trump administration wants to use these rules to try to mess with these shows, these networks that he has made clear he can't stand, wants to punish them. But the simple story that CBS just banned Talarico from being on air conflicts even with what Jasmine Crockett says she herself was told. But the media keeps bringing it back to the simplistic drama triangle: victim, villain, hero. Here is CNN's so-called media analyst, Brian Stelter.
Reminds me of a term Timothy Snyder has used. He's the author of the book On Tyranny. He talks about this as being an example of obeying in advance. He says most of the power in authoritarianism is given freely by individuals who think ahead to what a repressive government's going to do and then do it themselves. They obey in advance. And that's what many critics say CBS is doing in this instance.
When a Democrat argued that equal time rule should be enforced, would it have been tyrannical for the government to say, yes, you're right? If the Tonight Show back then had said, yeah, that's fair, we should have you on too, because of how the government might interpret this law, would that have been capitulating to tyranny? See, here's what I keep finding. People are panicked about Trump's authoritarian moves and instincts. So they set aside everything else. They don't look at the past. They don't think to the future. They just think we must fight this thing right now. If trying to enforce an equal time rule is tyrannical, then it would be for any administration to do so. In that case, challenge this Democrat running for governor. Ask him why he wanted the government to do that back then and whether he would still want this today in this new media landscape. Find out. Big media are ignoring these complexities. The absolute craziest thing I've heard anyone say about this in the news coming up. A big milestone is coming up as this show completes its second full year. We will reach the 100th episode. It is time-consuming and expensive to get you the truth. I'm up against bazillion-dollar corporate media that spread lies, but I'm so glad I'm doing it. In honor of the birthday, you can become a founding member of They Stand Corrected for a discounted rate right now. In return, you'll get all the benefits of membership, including unlimited access to the best fact-checking content there is, and the keys to accessing big legacy media for free, so you can save money. It's a win-win. Most importantly, you can help make this show possible. Every episode is designed to help us all build new synapses in our minds that guide us to truth and away from the media lies that manipulate us. Is your brain worth $1 a week, maybe? Celebrate with me. Then you can spend the next year knowing that They Stand Corrected reaches you and the world with your help. Check out the link in the show notes or my website, joshlevs.com, and you'll see what to do. It takes less than a minute, but the results last a whole year. Thank you. Because I spent so much time in broadcasting, I know that there is a normal process. Lawyers look at laws and the latest interpretations of those laws, whether from the courts or from executive branches at national, state, or local levels. and they advise. So in this case, it would make sense for the lawyers at CBS to tell Colbert's show that if you have Talarico and his opponents want to be interviewed, then you would have to let them be interviewed as well. Whether that's what actually happened here inside the show, we don't know. But CBS also put itself in this position by caving to Trump previously. As I reported here, they paid him millions of dollars to settle a lawsuit, and the company has big financial incentive to want to appease the president. All of these things can be true at once, just as we can call out Trump's dangerous actions and look to the past. And in drawing lessons and setting precedents today, we can think about implications for the future. All of these things can and should happen simultaneously. They don't conflict with each other. But in panic mode, people don't do that. The news media should. Unfortunately, that's clearly not happening. In preparing this episode, I came across a bunch of misleading comments from people in the media. Colbert had on a woman from CNN. Her name is Caitlin Collins. I was quoted in a news story that involved her. That's why when I saw this clip, her name was familiar to me. She had hosted this quote-unquote town hall with Trump before the election, which was just a historic disaster. He completely steamrolled the entire thing. It was a lie fest. She apparently now has a show on CNN, which is very CNN, to reward someone who hosted a literally epic lie fest. Anyway, she was on Colbert the other day talking about this equal time issue.
I think that you've seen some people on the right cheering this and saying, well, that's what we want Brendan Carr to do. I think that they don't want a Democratic administration saying that right-wing talk radio must give equal time to Democrats or to see that moment. I don't think anyone wants the federal government telling people who they should book on their show and who the guests should be on their show.
There's a lot of confusion about this, and she made it worse there. Remember I mentioned earlier, bona fide news interviews are exempt? Well, radio shows focused on the news have been considered exempt. So just as right-wing radio has that exemption, so does public radio. Fresh Air on NPR could have as many Democratic candidates as it wants, or WNYC in New York, without having to give equal time to their opponents, as long as that exemption applies. The issue in this case, and the Schwarzenegger case 20 years ago, is whether late-night comedy shows still apply. I also came across this. This is another bit from a guy I mentioned earlier on CNN, Brian Stelter.
It also reminds me of what Don Lemon recently said when he pled not guilty to those charges in Minnesota. He said, the process is the punishment. Lemon's probably going to be found not guilty. He's going to get out free after a jury trial. But the process is the punishment. And there's something similar happening here with the FCC.
Ugh. I can't believe how many things he managed to get wrong in just 15 seconds. First of all, a real journalist would never pretend to tell you what's going to happen in a jury trial. We don't know. Also, there might not be a jury trial. And if there's no punishment of any kind in that case he brought up, then what does that mean for private spaces for all of us? And as I've reported here, the law that protects the First Amendment rights of the people inside that St. Paul church, the law that these protesters seem to have violated, also protects reproductive health care clinics. If a streamer can join people who barge into that church and face no consequences, can a streamer join people who barge into a reproductive health care clinic and show people there? This is madness to just write off all these elements of that story. But this is what the media does these days. It's like the media takes a hammer to every story and keeps hammering at it until it's in the shape they want it to have. And they end up with this ugly pile of misshapen shreds. Hey, that image works. That is what it's like. I'm going to go back and give you a teaser for that in the intro for this episode. There is, of course, more to say about this, and I'm happy to dig into the parts that you ask me to. So let me know your questions, your thoughts, all kinds of feedback. There are two great ways to reach me. The best is through the newsletter, and the second is through a form at my website. As this episode comes out, the latest State of the Union address is taking place. I've written about it in the newsletter, and I will be posting fact checks for you. I'll track the media's coverage in the coming days. I write in the newsletter about why it's such a frustrating night and how it speaks to a problem with the core values in the media. We should have a media that is so instinctively built around truth that it doesn't even occur to the media to analyze a speech before they actually fact check it. But because they are so disastrous, they have their own terrible track records. And of course, Americans have learned not to trust them. Sometimes they lie in their own fact checks, as I have reported here. We need a truth counter movement. Anyway, I will bring you details about that in the newsletter and in the next episode. Some people say to me, hey, we want more frequent episodes. Well, let's see if we can make that happen. Share this show with everyone you've ever met. Get them to listen. Also, rate and review it. That's how you trigger the algorithms. Go into whatever app you use, give it 5 stars, write a great review if you're using Apple or one of the other ones that accepts reviews. If you're on Spotify, they do have ratings. Also a place where you can type in questions. And support the show in whatever ways you're able to. That is how it will become possible to grow this. As always, thank you so much for listening. I will see you next week.